The Korean Mafia boss orders in a foreign language to humiliate the waitress. He froze at her reply. He noticed her name tag, Chioma, let his eyes travel across her dark skin, and smiled the smile of a man who has already decided the outcome. To Vincenzo Cassano, the black waitress standing before him was not a person. She was a prop in the evening's performance. Soul Garden was his kind of place, the kind where powers sat down to dinner and lesser people served it. Tonight, he had chosen her as his entertainment. He did not know that Chioma Okafor was not just any server. He had no idea that his attempt to humiliate her would not only collapse in front of his own men, it would pull a single thread that began unraveling everything he had spent 2 decades building. This is the story of what happens when arrogance seats itself at the wrong table. If you love stories about hidden strength and perfect justice, hit that like button and subscribe, because this one pays off in full. The air inside Soul Garden, New York's most coveted Korean fine dining establishment, carried the scent of premium wagyu on open flame, aged doenjang simmering low, and the particular cologne of men who have never once been told no. For Chioma Okafor, it mostly smelled like survival. The warm light from the crystal chandeliers overhead fell across lacquered dark wood and silk-paneled walls hung with hand-brushed Korean calligraphy. This was not a restaurant. It was a theater of status, a place where transactions disguised themselves as dinners and hierarchies were performed over 12-course tasting menus. Chioma moved between the tables with the practiced grace of someone who had mastered the discipline of being useful without being seen. She had become very good at this, anticipating without intruding, smiling through words clearly intended to land below the skin, folding herself into the background of rooms she was far more qualified to lead. She straightened the bow tie at her collar and reset her posture. It was 9:45 on a Saturday night. The VIP section hummed with the low murmur of private deals and expensive restraint. Table 4 needed a second bottle. Table 7 had a complaint about the marination on the galbi. Keep moving, Chioma. Keep moving. Mr. Yoon, the restaurant owner, materialized at her elbow, a compact, perpetually damp man who communicated primarily in urgency. Tonight, the anxiety had sharpened into something closer to dread. His handkerchief was already out. Cassano is here, he whispered, the name barely clearing his lips. Table 1. Everything is perfect. Everything. The name passed through the staff like a current through a wire. Cassano. Not spoken, transmitted. Everyone who worked in rooms like this one knew the shape of the name even if they didn't know all its details. Vincenzo Cassano moved through the world as a legitimate businessman, import-export interests, real estate holdings across 3 continents, a foundation with a website and a mission statement. But the other architecture of his life existed in the spaces between the official record. Men who inconvenienced him stopped being inconvenient. Deals that should have fallen apart somehow didn't. He had the particular stillness of a man who has never needed to raise his voice because the consequences of his displeasure arrived well before he did. Chioma nodded once and moved toward table 1. What nobody in Soul Garden knew, not Mr. Yoon, not the other servers, and certainly not Vincenzo Cassano, was that Chioma Okafor was not just a waitress. 3 years earlier, she had been one of the United Nations most exceptional interpreters, fluent in 7 languages, operationally precise in dialects that most professional linguists never encountered. Korean was not just one of her languages. It was one of her weapons. And tonight, without knowing it, Vincenzo Cassano was about to ask her to use it. Chioma had a system. It had taken her 4 months to build it, 4 months of memorizing the preferences of regulars, learning which tables tipped generously and which ones tipped in proportion to how loudly they complained, understanding the exact moment to refill a glass before the guest noticed it was low. The system was not about waitressing. It was about control. In a life where so much had slipped from her hands, the system gave her something to hold. She moved through the dining room on autopilot now, her body tracing familiar paths between tables while her mind ran its quiet parallel calculations. The semester invoice from Columbia's College of Physicians and Surgeons was due in 11 days. Adiz had texted that morning, casual, careful not to worry her, but Chioma had read the subtext with the same precision she applied to everything. The rent on the studio in Flatbush renewed at the end of the week. And her father's last message from Lagos had mentioned the knee again, the way he always mentioned it, briefly, almost in passing, the way proud men announced the things they refused to ask for help with. She smiled at the gentleman on table 6 as she cleared his appetizer plate. The smile cost her nothing. She had learned that too. Soul Garden rewarded invisibility. The guests here did not want a personality standing over their wagyu, they wanted seamless, silent competence, a presence that resolved needs before they were articulated and then receded without trace. Chioma was exceptional at this, which was its own particular kind of grief. She held 2 advanced degrees. She had sat across from foreign ministers and rendered their most delicate words with precision. She had navigated negotiations where a single mistranslated syllable could have consequences that echoed for years. Now she was navigating the distance between the kitchen and table 4 without spilling the broth. She did not allow herself to dwell on the distance between those 2 versions of her life. Dwelling was a luxury. She had a system. She had a shift to finish. She had people depending on her to hold it together, and Chioma Okafor had never once put that weight down. She felt it before she saw it. There was no announcement, no raised voice, no visible signal passed between the staff. And yet, in the span of perhaps 4 seconds, the entire atmosphere of Soul Garden reorganized itself. The hum of conversation dropped half a register. The sommelier, mid-pour at table 9, completed the movement with unusual care, as if sudden gestures had become inadvisable. In the kitchen, the clatter of preparation seemed to pull back from the pass, sound softening behind the swinging door like a held breath. Chioma looked up. Vincenzo Cassano stood at the entrance. He was not a large man, not in the way that immediately commanded a room through physical scale. He was lean, precise, the kind of build that suggested nothing was carried that didn't serve a purpose. The suit was dark and immaculate, cut close, white shirt open at the collar with no tie, as if the conventions that applied to other men had been considered and declined. The neck tattoo emerged from his collar and climbed the left side of his throat, an intricate, deliberate thing that in any other setting might have seemed decorative. Here, framed by the way the room had already rearranged itself around his arrival, it read as exactly what it was. A mark that said, "I operate outside the boundaries you're comfortable with, and I always have." He did not scan the room. He assessed it, slowly, completely, the way a man reviews an inventory he already owns. His eyes moved across tables and faces with the unhurried patience of someone who has never once needed to rush a conclusion. When Mr. Yoon appeared at his side, bowing with the compressed urgency of a man trying to make himself as useful as possible as quickly as possible, Vincenzo acknowledged him with the smallest inclination of his head. That was all it took. Mr. Yoon began moving, gesturing silently to staff, smoothing the path to table 1 with the efficiency of someone who understood that being slow had consequences he preferred not to revisit. 2 men followed Cassano in. They did not speak. They did not need to. Chioma watched him sit, and updated her system accordingly. She had not always carried trays. There was a version of Chioma Okafor that existed in conference rooms in Geneva, in briefing suites in Nairobi, in the hushed interpretation booths that overlooked the General Assembly floor, where the weight of sovereign nations passed through her voice and came out precisely, immaculately rendered in another tongue. 7 languages. Not collected casually, built, one by one, with the kind of deliberate effort that leaves marks. Korean had taken 3 years of total immersion, 2 postings across Seoul and Busan, and one particularly exacting mentor who had refused to compliment her until the regional inflections were indistinguishable from a native speaker's. He had complimented her, eventually. She had been good at the work in the way that mattered most, not just technically fluent, but culturally fluent. She understood what people meant beneath what they said. She could hear the class in a man's vowels, the region in his idiom, the intent buried 3 layers below his vocabulary. In rooms where language was the instrument of power, she had been exceptionally well armed. And then came the inquiry. A diplomatic communication, sensitive, classified, connected to a multilateral negotiation she had interpreted across 4 sessions. It surfaced somewhere it should not have. An investigation opened with the quiet, procedural efficiency that institutions deploy when they have already decided the outcome and need only to construct the path toward it. The actual source of the leak was never named. It didn't need to be. What was needed was a resolution, and Chioma, talented, visible, without the institutional seniority to make herself costly to sacrifice, was a clean one. She had fought it for 8 months. Then she had stopped, because fighting required resources she no longer had and was depleting the ones she needed to protect her family. The clearances went first. Then the contract. Then the professional references that quietly stopped being returned. Then the apartment in Brooklyn that the UN's salary had made possible. Then the tray. The bow tie. The system. She balanced 3 dishes on her left arm now with the same precision she had once applied to simultaneous interpretation, every movement calibrated, nothing wasted, no one the wiser about what the hands carrying their dinner had once been trained to do. She had not always carried trays. There was a version of Chioma Okafor that existed in conference rooms in Geneva, in briefing suites in Nairobi, in the hushed interpretation booths that overlooked the General Assembly floor, where the weight of sovereign nations passed through her voice and came out precisely, immaculately rendered in another tongue. 7 languages. Not collected casually, built, one by one, with the kind of deliberate effort that leaves marks. Korean had taken 3 years of total immersion, 2 postings across Seoul and Busan, and one particularly exacting mentor who had refused to compliment her until the regional inflections were indistinguishable from a native speaker's. He had complimented her, eventually. She had been good at the work in the way that mattered most, not just technically fluent, but culturally fluent. She understood what people meant beneath what they said. She could hear the class in a man's vowels, the region in his idiom, the intent buried 3 layers below his vocabulary. In rooms where language was the instrument of power, she had been exceptionally well armed. And then came the inquiry. A diplomatic communication, sensitive, classified, connected to a multilateral negotiation she had interpreted across 4 sessions. It surfaced somewhere it should not have. An investigation opened with the quiet, procedural efficiency that institutions deploy when they have already decided the outcome and need only to construct the path toward it. The actual source of the leak was never named. It didn't need to be. What was needed was a resolution, and Chioma, talented, visible, without the institutional seniority to make herself costly to sacrifice, was a clean one. She had fought it for 8 months. Then she had stopped, because fighting required resources she no longer had and was depleting the ones she needed to protect her family. The clearances went first. Then the contract. Then the professional references that quietly stopped being returned. Then the apartment in Brooklyn that the UN's salary had made possible. Then the tray. The bow tie. The system. She balanced 3 dishes on her left arm now with the same precision she had once applied to simultaneous interpretation, every movement calibrated, nothing wasted, no one the wiser about what the hands carrying their dinner had once been trained to do. He had been watching her since she approached the table. Not with interest, with calculation. The particular attention of a man who selects rather than notices, who looks at a room and identifies not what is beautiful but what is useful, and not what is useful but what is vulnerable. Chioma had set down the water glasses, recited the evening specials with clean professional precision, and asked if he had any questions about the menu. He had not answered immediately. He had let the silence sit, the way men like him use silence, as a demonstration that your time was not equivalent to his. Then he smiled. And she recognized the smile. She had seen its architecture before, in certain corridors of power where people sometimes remembered they could say anything they liked to the woman holding the notepad. He turned to the man on his left and said something in Korean. Fast, low, buried inside a laugh. The dialect was not standard. It came from somewhere specific, the compressed, clipped cadence of streets she recognized immediately, layered with a particular vocabulary that did not appear in any curriculum she had ever studied formally, because it was never written down. It was passed mouth to ear in backrooms and understood only by those who had earned, or survived, admission to the spaces where it was spoken. She understood every word. He was describing her to his associate the way a man describes an object he is about to use for a demonstration. Then he turned back and addressed her directly, still in Korean, faster now, the register dropping further underground. He ordered a dish with the technical specificity of someone who expected her to flounder in the terminology. He added preparation requirements drawn from a regional tradition so specific that even most Korean speakers would have requested clarification. And then, wrapped so deep inside the language that it wore fluency as a disguise, he said something about her that had nothing to do with the food. He reached for his water glass, utterly unbothered. Already composing his expression for the moment she would apologize in confused English and go find someone who could help. He had done this before. He already knew how it ended. Chioma did not move. Not immediately. She stood exactly where she was, notepad at her side, and for 3 seconds, 3 full, complete seconds, she was absolutely still. To anyone watching from across the room, she might have appeared to be simply processing the order, running through the menu in her mind, preparing to excuse herself politely and return with a more senior member of staff. That was not what was happening. In the first second, she heard Adi's voice from their last phone call, the careful brightness her sister deployed when she was worried, the way she had said "I'm fine, Chi," really in the exact tone that meant the opposite. She heard the specific silence that followed when Chioma had told her the payment would clear by Friday. In the second, she saw the number at the bottom of the Columbia invoice. She saw the rent notification on her phone screen, the one she had closed without opening fully because opening it completely would have made it more real than she could afford for it to be that morning. She felt the specific weight of her father's pride, the pride that prevented him from asking, that would prevent him until it couldn't anymore, and the corresponding weight she carried in its place. In the third second, she made a calculation. Not an emotional one. A precise, clear-eyed assessment of cost versus cost. The cost of silence. The cost of not. Something resolved. It moved through her the way decisions move when they have been made at a level below conscious thought, a quiet settling, a realignment of the spine, a stillness that was different in quality from the stillness that preceded it. She raised her eyes. She looked directly at Vincenzo Cassano. Not at his collar, not at the middle distance above his shoulder, at his face, his eyes, the exact place that the culture he had built his power inside reserved exclusively for equals and superiors. In that culture, she knew precisely what the gesture communicated. She knew he knew it too. She watched him register it, and she began to speak. She answered him in Korean. Not the careful, textbook Korean of a foreign language graduate. Not the polished, formal register of an interpreter working a diplomatic brief. She answered him in his Korean, the compressed, backstreet cadence of the dialect he had chosen specifically because he believed it was a lock she didn't have the key to. Every inflection landed in the right place. Every piece of criminal shorthand he had embedded in his order she returned without hesitation, fluently, the way you return something that belongs to you. She confirmed the dish first. The full preparation, the specific regional technique he had named, the traditional style, the correct accompaniments, described with the kind of granular cultural knowledge that cannot be performed. It can only be earned. She offered a refinement, in the same dialect, that demonstrated she not only understood what he had ordered but knew enough to improve upon it. Across the table, one of his associates set down his glass slowly. Then she addressed the other part of what he had said. She did it without raising her voice, without changing her posture, without any of the theatrical signals that would have made it easy for him to categorize as emotional or reactive. She simply noted, in the same underground register he had used, that a man with his particular portfolio of business interests, and she named the shape of those interests with a specificity that had nothing to do with his public-facing biography, might want to be thoughtful about what he said in rooms where the acoustics were better than he assumed. She closed with a single observation about the insult he had delivered, the one he had been certain was invisible to her, that was so dry and so precise that the man to Vincenzo's right found something very interesting to look at on the tablecloth. Then she stopped. Notepad at her side. Expression professional. Waiting. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of a man composing his reply. It was the silence of a structure discovering, very suddenly, that the ground beneath it had changed. Vincenzo Cassano looked at her. And for the first time and longer than he could remember, he had nothing to say. Mr. Yoon had not met her eyes when he walked her to the office. That told her everything. She had been in enough rooms where decisions had already been made to recognize the particular quality of an apology that arrives before the words do. He had gestured her through the door, said he would be back in a moment, and closed it quietly behind her, the courtesy of a man who felt guilty about something he was going to do anyway. Chioma sat down and opened her calculator. It was a reflex, the same one that had carried her through every setback of the last 3 years. Don't feel it yet. Quantify it first. She ran the numbers with the focused calm of someone who has had a great deal of practice doing mathematics under pressure. If she lost this position tonight, she had 11 days before the tuition payment bounced. The rent she could manage for perhaps 3 weeks on what remained in her account. Her father she would handle last, and quietly, the way she always did. She was still calculating when the door opened. It was not Mr. Yoon. The man who entered was elderly, mid-70s, she estimated, with silver hair cut close and the kind of posture that does not arrive naturally but is built over decades of deliberate discipline. His suit was understated in the way that very expensive things sometimes are. He had been at the corner table all evening, she recalled now. Green tea. A newspaper he had not appeared to actually read. He closed the door behind him and considered her for a moment with the unhurried attention of someone who already knows what they are looking at. Your interpretation of the Sejong address, he said in Korean, was the finest rendering I have heard in 30 years of this work. Chioma went very still. He told her his name. He told her what he did, what he had done, for a very long time, for institutions whose names she recognized from her most classified briefings. He told her what he knew about her termination, and who had engineered it, and why. Then he placed a business card on the table, and said nothing further. He didn't need to. 3 months later, the fluorescent lights of a task force interview room in Lower Manhattan cast everything in the same flat gray, the metal table, the two-way mirror, the face of Vincenzo Cassano as he was guided through the door by a federal marshal who didn't bother with pleasantries. Vincenzo straightened his collar out of habit. He'd done this before. Rooms like this were just theater, and he knew his lines. Then he saw her. Chioma did not look up immediately. She let him stand there, let the silence do its work, her hand resting on a dossier 3 inches thick with his name on the tab. When she did raise her eyes, she was unhurried. Credentialed badge clipped at her lapel. Pen uncapped. The particular stillness of someone who has already decided how this ends. She watched the moment land on him, the recalibration behind his eyes, the slight parting of his mouth as recognition arrived and rearranged everything he thought he understood about this room, this morning, this woman sitting exactly where power sits. She said his full name the way a door closes. He sat down. Across an ocean, in a house in Lagos where the ceiling fan turned slow and the evening air smelled of rain on red earth, her father slept in his chair with his hands folded in his lap, his breathing even, unbothered by the weight of old fears. Down the hall, her sister's phone lit up with a notification, exam results, and her sharp, solitary cry of relief moved through the house like something released. Chioma Okafor would hear about both moments later, in a phone call full of laughter and interruptions and her mother saying her name 3 times just to say it. But first, this room. This man. This work. She was not who she was because of what had been done to her. She was who she was because of every deliberate, costly, luminous thing she had chosen to do with it. She opened to the first page.